The massive auditorium buzzed with excited voices as hundreds of cadets took their seats. Students from across the galaxy filled the curved rows. Tall, blue-skinned Rigelians with their forearms crossed, small furry Centaurians chattering in their high-pitched voices, and the insect-like Vectar species clicking their mandibles in what passed for laughter among their kind. Jiho Kim slipped into a seat near the back, keeping his head down as he always did. Being one of only 12 humans at the Galactic Military Academy made him stand out whether he wanted to or not. His plain brown hair and average height seemed unremarkable compared to his alien classmates, but that was exactly how he preferred it. The conversations around him were a mix of different languages and translation devices humming softly. Two Altarian cadets behind him were discussing their weekend plans in their musical language that sounded like wind chimes. To his left, a massive Ursine cadet was reviewing notes on his tablet, occasionally grunting in approval at something. He read, "Attention, cadets!" The voice boomed through the auditorium's sound system. Professor Vectar stepped onto the stage below, his 6 legs carrying his spider-like form with surprising grace. His reputation preceded him, the most respected military tactician in the Academy, possibly in the entire galaxy. He had studied every major battle of the last century and written the standard textbooks on space warfare that every cadet memorized. The chatter died instantly. Even the most rebellious students knew better than to talk during one of Professor Vectar's lectures. His compound eyes could spot a whisper from across the room, and his punishments were legendary. "Today we examine one of the most puzzling victories in recent military history," Professor Vectar began, his translator making his clicking speech sound crisp and clear. "The Battle of Kepler 442b, fought 3 years ago between the human Third Fleet and the Hegemony's 7th Strike Force." A holographic display materialized above the stage, showing the Kepler system in miniature. Tiny ships moved through space, blue dots representing human vessels and red showing the enemy fleet. Jiho recognized the system immediately: the twin suns, the asteroid belt, the green and brown planet that had been home to 2 million human colonists. The tactical situation was clear. Professor Vectar continued, using a laser pointer to highlight different areas of the display. The Hegemony force numbered 47 heavy cruisers and over 200 support vessels. They had established a complete blockade of the human colony world. More ships appeared on the display, forming a tight ring around the planet. The mathematical precision was beautiful in its deadliness. No ship could land or leave without running straight into Hegemony guns. Against this overwhelming force, the humans sent Admiral Sunmi Park with just 18 ships, 18 vessels against nearly 300. Professor Vectar's mandibles clicked in what Jiho had learned was the equivalent of a chuckle. The outcome should have been obvious. Several alien cadets laughed along with their professor. A draconian student 2 rows ahead turned to his friend and made a comment about human stupidity that his translator picked up. Jiho's hands clenched into fists, but he kept quiet. "Let us examine Admiral Park's first decision," Professor Vectar said, manipulating the hologram to show the human fleet's approach. Instead of concentrating her forces for maximum firepower, she divided them into 3 groups. Basic military doctrine states that dividing your forces when outnumbered is tactical suicide. The display showed the human ships splitting apart, each group heading in a different direction. One group went high above the system's plane, another dropped low below it, and the third headed straight through the asteroid belt. Worse still, Admiral Park chose to engage the enemy at 3 separate points simultaneously. This violated every principle of force concentration we teach in Strategy 101. Professor Vectar gestured to the cadets with one of his arms. "Can anyone tell me why this was a mistake?" Several hands shot up immediately. A Centaurian cadet in the front row was chosen to answer. "Sir, by dividing her forces, Admiral Park ensured that each group would be overwhelmed individually. The Hegemony could defeat them one by one instead of facing the combined human fleet." "Exactly correct, Cadet Zirna. And yet..." Professor Vectar paused dramatically, letting the suspense build. "The humans won. Not only did they win, they completely destroyed the Hegemony blockade and evacuated over 90% of the colonial population." The auditorium erupted in surprised murmurs. Even though most cadets knew the outcome, hearing it stated so bluntly was still shocking. How could 18 ships defeat 300? The victory has puzzled military scholars for 3 years. Professor Vector continued. Some suggest the humans got incredibly lucky. Others propose that the hegemony commanders made critical errors. A few radical theorists even claim that human tactics operate on principles we do not yet understand. He manipulated the hologram again, showing the battle's climax. Red ships exploded in brilliant flashes, while blue ships darted between them like angry wasps. The pattern looked chaotic, nothing like the orderly formations taught in their textbooks. What we can observe is this: human forces engaged in what appeared to be random, desperate attacks. They ignored standard communication protocols, broke formation repeatedly, and individual ship commanders made decisions without waiting for orders from their superiors. Professor Vector's tone suggested he found such behavior distasteful. By all logical analysis, this should have resulted in disaster. Jiho shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The professor was describing the battle like it was a puzzle to be solved, a mathematical equation with an unexpected result. But it had been so much more than that. Real people had died in those random, desperate attacks. Real families had been saved by those illogical decisions. The most likely explanation is statistical chance, Professor Vector concluded. In warfare, unlikely outcomes do occasionally occur. The humans, through a combination of luck and the enemy's overconfidence, achieved a victory that their tactics should not have made possible. He gestured to the hologram, which now showed the aftermath: debris fields where the hegemony fleet had been, and streams of evacuation ships carrying civilians to safety. This battle serves as an important reminder that we must always account for random variables in our calculations, even when victory seems mathematically certain. Jiho felt his jaw clench tighter. Random variables, statistical chance. Is that really how the galaxy saw humanity's greatest military victory? As nothing more than a lucky accident? Are there any questions about this analysis? Professor Vector asked, scanning the auditorium with his compound eyes. The massive hall fell silent. Hundreds of cadets sat motionless, not wanting to risk the professor's attention. This was normal. Most students were too intimidated to speak up in Professor Vector's classes, but today was different. Today, one student could not stay quiet. Jiho Kim stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. Every head in the auditorium turned toward him. Hundreds of alien eyes focused on the lone human in the back row. Professor Vector's compound eyes fixed on him with sharp attention. "Yes, Cadet Kim? You have a question about the tactical analysis?" Jiho took a deep breath, knowing that what he said next would change everything. His voice was steady despite his racing heart, carrying clearly through the silent auditorium. "Professor, with all due respect, your analysis is incomplete. I know because I was there. I battled at Kepler 442b. The silence that followed was absolute. Not a single cadet moved or made a sound. Professor Vector's mandibles stopped clicking entirely, and his laser pointer slowly lowered to his side. In that moment, the academic discussion of tactical theory became something much more personal. The Battle of Kepler 442b was no longer just a case study to be analyzed. It was a story that demanded to be told. The auditorium exploded with noise. Cadets turned to each other with wide eyes, talking in excited whispers. Some made sounds of disbelief, clicking, chirping, and growling in their various languages. The translation devices worked overtime, filling the air with overlapping conversations about the young human who claimed to have fought in the legendary battle. Professor Vector raised one of his 6 arms, and the noise stopped immediately. His compound eyes focused on Jiho with laser intensity. "Impossible, Cadet Kim. You are barely 19 standard years old according to your academy records. The Battle of Kepler 442b occurred 3 years ago." Jiho remained standing, feeling the weight of hundreds of stares pressing down on him. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice stayed firm. "I was 16 when I enlisted, sir. Humanity was desperate. The hegemony had blockaded our core worlds for 8 months. Trade had stopped completely. Food shipments couldn't get through. People were starting to starve." He paused, remembering those dark months when every human colony lived in fear. The military started taking volunteers of any age who could hold a plasma rifle and follow orders. They needed bodies more than they needed experience. A draconian. Cadet near the front turned around completely in his seat. "You expect us to believe that humans send children to fight wars?" His translator made his hissing voice sound skeptical and slightly disgusted. "Not children," Jiho replied, meeting the alien's golden eyes. "Desperate people protecting their families. I had a choice. Sit at home and watch my sister starve or pick up a weapon and do something about it." Professor Vektar's mandibles clicked slowly. "Very well, Cadet Kim. If you truly served at Kepler 442b, then tell us what your academic analysis missed. What did Admiral Park actually do that made victory possible?" Jiho took another deep breath. This was his chance to honor the memory of everyone who had fought and died in that battle. They deserved better than being called a statistical anomaly. "First thing you got wrong is calling it random," Jiho said. "Admiral Park didn't split her forces because she was confused or desperate. She did it because she understood something about the hegemony that your textbooks missed." The holographic display still showed the battle formation, with the human ships divided into 3 groups. Jiho gestured toward it. The hegemony fleet followed standard blockade protocol. They positioned themselves in a perfect sphere around the planet, with equal spacing between all ships. It looked unbreakable from the outside. Professor Vektar nodded. "Standard defensive formation, maximum coverage with overlapping fields of fire." But Admiral Park had studied hegemony tactics for years, Jiho continued. She knew they would never break formation to chase individual groups. Their commanders are trained to maintain position no matter what. So when she split our fleet, she wasn't dividing our strength. She was exploiting their weakness. Several alien cadets leaned forward with interest. This was starting to sound like actual strategy instead of blind luck. "I was assigned to the destroyer Soul's Pride, part of the group that went through the asteroid belt," Jiho said. "Our ship was old and small, just a converted cargo hauler with plasma cannons bolted to the sides. The corridors were so cramped, you had to turn sideways to pass someone going the other direction." He could still smell the recycled air of that ship, thick with the scent of too many bodies in too small a space. "Captain Soman Lee told us we weren't there to fight the entire hegemony fleet. We just had to hit one specific target and get out alive." "What target?" Professor Vektar asked, his academic curiosity overriding his skepticism. "The command ship," Jiho said. "Every hegemony fleet has one vessel that coordinates all the others. Admiral Park figured out which ship it was by studying their communication patterns. While the main battle was happening above and below the system plane, our group snuck through the asteroids to hit the command vessel." The hologram showed the path the human ships had taken, weaving between spinning rocks and debris. It looked impossibly dangerous, even in the simplified display. "The asteroids provided cover from their sensors," Jiho explained. "But they also made navigation deadly. One wrong move and you'd crash into a rock moving at thousands of kilometers per hour." He remembered watching through the viewport as house-sized boulders spun past just meters from the hull. A Centaurian cadet raised her small hand. "How did human pilots manage such precise flying? Our own pilots trained for years before attempting asteroid navigation." Jiho almost smiled at the question. "That's another thing your analysis missed, sir. Most of our pilots weren't academy graduates. They were miners, asteroid prospectors, and cargo haulers who had spent their whole lives flying through dangerous terrain. Captain Lee used to run supply missions to the outer mining stations. She could thread a cargo ship through an asteroid." "Field in her sleep?" Professor Vektar's posture shifted slightly. "You are suggesting that the humans' supposed tactical errors were actually advantages drawn from civilian experience?" "Exactly," Jiho said, feeling more confident now. "When you called our formations chaotic, you were seeing experienced pilots, using skills they'd learned outside the military. They didn't fight like academy graduates because they weren't academy graduates." The room was completely quiet now. Even the most skeptical cadets were listening intently as Jiho painted a picture very different from their textbooks. "The attack on the command ship worked perfectly," Jiho continued. "We came out of the asteroid field right behind their formation, hit them with everything we had, and disappeared back into the rocks before they could respond. Without central coordination, the hegemony fleet started making mistakes." He gestured to the hologram again. "That's when Admiral Park's other 2 groups struck. The enemy ships were trying to reorganize their formation, which meant they had to move. And moving ships are easier targets than stationary ones." Professor Vektar manipulated the display, showing the battle's progression. "The tactical records," show significant confusion in hegemony movements during this phase. Ships breaking position, overlapping fields of fire, several collision incidents. They were used to fighting enemies who followed the same rules they did, Jiho said. Formal. Battle lines, predictable maneuvers, everything done by the book. But humans don't fight by the book when people are dying. A massive Ursine cadet spoke up from the middle section. This still sounds like you got lucky. What if the hegemony had adapted faster? Jiho's expression grew serious. Some of them did adapt. The battle wasn't easy and it wasn't quick. We lost good ships and good people. He paused, thinking of faces he would never see again. But that brings me to the second thing Professor Vector missed in his analysis. Which is? The professor asked. You assumed we were fighting to win a battle? Jiho said quietly. But we weren't fighting for victory. We were fighting for survival. Not just our own survival, but the survival of 2 million civilians on that planet below. The weight of those words settled over the auditorium like a heavy blanket. 2 million. Lives hanging in the balance while 18 ships faced impossible odds. When you're fighting for your family's life, Jiho said, lucky accidents start looking a lot like miracles. Professor Vector's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign that his analytical mind was working hard. Cadet Kim, your account explains some tactical decisions, but it does not address the most puzzling elements of the battle. For example, the complete destruction of the hegemony flagship by a single human vessel. The holographic display changed to show a massive hegemony dreadnought, easily 5 times larger than any human ship. Its thick armor and powerful shields should have made it nearly indestructible. According to our records, Professor Vector continued, the destroyer Busan Runner approached this vessel alone and somehow caused a catastrophic explosion that destroyed both ships. Our analysis shows this was mathematically impossible with conventional weapons. Several alien cadets nodded in agreement. The physics simply didn't make sense. A small destroyer could not possibly generate enough firepower to damage a dreadnought, let alone destroy it completely. Jiho closed his eyes for a moment, remembering Commander Yun Cho's final transmission. When he opened them again, his voice was softer, but somehow more intense. Commander Cho didn't attack that ship with conventional weapons, Professor. He turned his entire destroyer into a weapon. Explain, Professor Vector demanded. The Busan Runner was already damaged from earlier fighting, Jiho said. Their main engines were failing, and they had lost most of their shields. Commander Cho could have retreated to the medical ships for repairs. That's what military doctrine says to do when your vessel is no longer combat effective. Jiho looked around the auditorium, meeting the eyes of cadets from different species. But Commander Cho saw that the hegemony flagship was moving toward the evacuation zone. Those big ships carry planet-killer missiles. If it reached firing position, it could destroy every evacuation transport in one strike. The room was completely silent. Even Professor Vector had stopped his usual clicking. So, Commander Cho made a decision that your textbooks would call wasteful destruction of assets. Jiho continued. He ordered his crew to overload the ship's reactor while broadcasting a fake distress signal. The Busan Runner drifted toward the enemy flagship, looking like a helpless wreck. Professor Vector's compound eyes widened. He deliberately allowed the enemy to capture his vessel? The hegemony follows strict protocols about disabled enemy ships, Jiho explained. They always try to capture them for intelligence purposes. So when the Busan Runner appeared to be drifting powerlessly, the flagship moved closer to take it aboard. The holographic display showed the massive hegemony ship extending capture beams toward the small human destroyer. It looked like a giant, reaching down to pick up a broken toy. Commander Cho waited until they were locked in the tractor beam, Jiho said quietly. Then he detonated his overloaded reactor at point-blank range. The explosion tore through both ships' hulls. A Centaurian cadet near the front made a high-pitched sound of distress. The entire crew died. All 37 people aboard the Busan Runner, Jiho confirmed. But their sacrifice destroyed the flagship and saved 300,000 evacuating civilians. Commander Cho knew exactly what he was trading, 37 lives for 300,000. Professor Vector was quiet for several long moments. Such tactics violate every principle of asset preservation we teach. A ship and crew are valuable resources that should not be wasted. Wasted? Jiho's voice rose slightly. The first time. He had shown real anger. Commander Cho and his crew weren't wasted, Professor. They were invested. They chose to spend their lives to buy safety for others. An Altarian cadet in the middle section spoke up, her musical voice translated into standard galactic. But surely this was an isolated incident, one desperate commander making an emotional decision? Jiho shook his head. That's the third thing your analysis got wrong, sir. You keep looking for the one brilliant strategy or the single lucky break that won the battle. But there wasn't just one moment. There were hundreds of moments when individual humans made the same choice Commander Cho made. He gestured toward the holographic display, which now showed the entire battle space with dozens of small engagements, happening simultaneously. Lieutenant Somin Kang was leading a fighter squadron when she received orders to retreat. Her pilots were exhausted, their ships were damaged, and they were almost out of ammunition. The display zoomed in on a section showing tiny fighter craft weaving between larger vessels. But Lieutenant Kang saw enemy bombers heading for the evacuation transports. Her squadron was the only thing between those bombers and 10,000 civilian refugees. Professor Vector manipulated the hologram to track the fighters' movement. The tactical record shows her squadron broke formation and engaged superior numbers without support. Standard doctrine considers this insubordination. Lieutenant Kang disobeyed her orders, Jiho agreed. She led her 8 remaining fighters through the wreckage of a partially collapsed space station, using the debris as cover. The enemy bombers were larger and more powerful, but they couldn't maneuver in the tight spaces between broken metal beams. The holographic display showed the twisted remains of the space station, a complex maze of broken corridors and shattered hull plates. Flying through it at combat speeds looked like navigating a death trap. How did human pilots manage such precise flying in those conditions? Asked a draconian cadet. Because they weren't thinking about flying, Jiho said. They were thinking about the families on those evacuation ships. Lieutenant Kang's own parents were aboard one of the transports. She wasn't following tactical doctrine. She was protecting her family. He looked around the room again, seeing understanding begin to dawn on some faces. That's what your analysis keeps missing, Professor. You're trying to understand our tactics as if they were mathematical equations, but every decision was made by someone who had a personal reason to fight. Professor Vector's posture shifted. You are suggesting that human military effectiveness stems from emotional attachment rather than logical strategy? I'm saying they work together, Jiho replied. Lieutenant Kang knew the tactical situation was hopeless. 8 fighters against 20 bombers should have been a massacre. But she also knew that giving up wasn't an option. The hologram showed the fighters darting through the space station wreckage, using broken walls and twisted metal to ambush the larger bombers. It looked chaotic and desperate, but it was working. She turned the debris field into a weapon. Jiho continued. The enemy bombers had to slow down and fly in single file through the narrow passages. That gave her fighters a chance to pick them off one by one. And the result? Professor Vector asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. All 8 human fighters were destroyed, Jiho said simply. Lieutenant Kang and her pilots died in that wreckage, but they took down 19 of the 20 enemy bombers. The evacuation transports escaped safely. The auditorium was completely quiet again. The weight of so much sacrifice was almost overwhelming. You keep calling our tactics unpredictable, Jiho said, his voice growing stronger. But there was a pattern that your computers missed. Every impossible decision was made by someone who refused to accept that protecting innocent people was impossible. Professor Vector studied the holographic display for a long moment. Cadet Kim, you are describing a military philosophy that prioritizes individual initiative over centralized command, emotional bonds over logical calculation, and mission success over personal survival. Yes, sir, Jiho said. That's exactly what I'm describing, and that's why we won. Jiho's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and every cadet in the massive auditorium leaned forward to hear him. The weight of what he was about to share seemed to press down on his shoulders like a physical burden. Everything I've told you so far happened in the first 6 hours of battle, he said quietly. The real test came when Admiral Park received a message from the hegemony commander. They had captured over 15,000 human civilians during their initial attack on the colony. Men, women, children, elderly people who couldn't evacuate in time. Professor Vector's mandibles stopped clicking entirely. Hostages. The hegemony. Ultimatum was simple, Jiho continued. Admiral Park had 1 hour to surrender her entire fleet, or they would execute every prisoner. They sent video proof that they had the civilians aboard their prison ships. The holographic display changed to show several large hegemony vessels marked with detention facility symbols. Even in the simplified diagram, they looked ominous and heavily fortified. Standard military doctrine is clear about hostage situations, Professor Vector said slowly. Never negotiate with enemies who use civilian captives as leverage. It only encourages them to take more hostages in future conflicts. That's exactly what Admiral Park's orders said, Jiho agreed. Command Headquarters sent her a direct message. Do not surrender fleet assets to save captured personnel. The math was simple from their perspective. 18 military ships were worth more than 15,000 civilian lives. Several alien cadets shifted uncomfortably. The cold calculation made sense from a strategic viewpoint, but something about it felt wrong when stated so bluntly. So, what did Admiral Park do? Asked a Rigelian cadet from the middle section. She ordered a full assault on the prison ships, Jiho said. Not to ignore the hostages, but to save them before the enemy could carry out their threat. The auditorium erupted in surprised sounds from various species. This was the opposite of what any military academy taught about hostage scenarios. Impossible, declared a draconian cadet. Prison ships are designed to be impregnable. Heavy armor, multiple shield layers, defensive weapons, and they were protected by the main hegemony fleet. You're right, Jiho said. It should have been impossible. The prison ships were floating fortresses surrounded by enemy warships. Any direct attack would fail, and the hostages would be killed in retaliation. Professor Vector manipulated the holographic display to show the tactical situation. The prison ships sat in the center of the hegemony formation, protected by overlapping fields of defensive fire. But Admiral Park didn't order a conventional assault, Jiho continued. She called for volunteers for what she called close insertion missions. That was military language for suicide runs. The hologram changed to show small human shuttles and fighters breaking away from the main fleet. They moved in seemingly random directions, making no attempt to maintain formation or coordinate their attacks. I volunteered, Jiho said simply. So did about 200 other people from across the fleet. We knew most of us wouldn't come back. A Centaurian cadet made a sound of disbelief. You volunteered for a suicide mission? Why? For the first time, since he had started speaking, Jiho's composure cracked. His voice wavered slightly as he answered. Because my sister Yuna was on one of those prison ships. The silence that followed was complete and profound. Every cadet in the auditorium understood now why this battle meant so much more than tactical analysis to the young human. Sergeant Minho Bay led the assault on Prison Ship 7. Jiho continued, his voice growing steadier as he focused on honoring the memory of the fallen. He was a cargo loader before the war started, never went to military school, never studied advanced tactics, but he knew how to move heavy things through tight spaces. The holographic display showed the interior of a massive prison ship, a maze of corridors, holding cells, and security checkpoints. It looked like trying to fight through a fortress while protecting thousands of helpless people. Sergeant Bay's team used maintenance shafts and cargo tunnels to reach the detention areas, Jiho explained. The hegemony guards were expecting a frontal assault, not people crawling through the ship's ventilation system. Professor Vector studied the display with professional interest. Unconventional approach vectors. But how did they avoid the ship's internal security systems? They didn't avoid them, Jiho said. They triggered every alarm on purpose. While the guards were rushing to investigate security breaches in one section, Sergeant Bay's team was cutting through cell walls in another section. The tactical display showed red alarm indicators spreading throughout the prison ship like a virus, with security forces chasing false alerts while the real rescue operation happened elsewhere. But this created chaos throughout the ship, Professor Vector observed. How did the rescue teams locate specific prisoners in such confusion? Jiho's voice grew soft again. The prisoners helped. When they heard human voices in the corridors, they started calling out. Parents shouting their children's names, families trying to find each other. The sound guided our people through the maze. He paused, remembering the echoing voices that had filled those metal corridors. I was with the team that reached Section C7. That's where they were keeping the families from New Soul Colony. When I heard my sister calling my name, Jiho stopped speaking for several seconds, his throat tight with emotion. The entire auditorium waited patiently while he composed himself. Sergeant Bay found her first, he finally continued. She was helping take care of younger children whose parents had been separated from them. When she saw me, she just smiled and said, "I knew you would come." Several alien cadets were making sounds of sympathy in their various languages. Even species that didn't understand human emotion could recognize the bond between family members. But getting to the prisoners was only half the mission, Jiho said. We still had to get them out of the ship and back to our fleet. 15,000 frightened civilians don't move quickly through narrow corridors. The holographic display showed the massive logistical challenge, thousands of people who needed to be evacuated through a ship that was actively trying to kill them. That's when Sergeant Bay made the decision that saved everyone, Jiho continued. The main exit routes were blocked by enemy forces. The hegemony was sealing blast doors and flooding sections with toxic gas. We were trapped. Professor Vector leaned forward with interest. How did he solve this tactical problem? He didn't solve it, Jiho said quietly. He sacrificed himself to create a solution. The main blast door to the docking bay was sealed and locked down. It would take hours to cut through with our equipment, and we didn't have hours. The display showed a massive security door, easily 3 meters thick, and designed to withstand military-grade explosives. Sergeant Bay found the manual override system, Jiho continued, but someone had to stay behind and hold the lever in place while everyone else evacuated. The system was damaged. If you let go of the lever, the door would slam shut immediately. The terrible implication hit the alien cadets immediately. Several made sounds of distress as they understood what this meant. Sergeant Bay ordered everyone else to run, Jiho said. 15,000 civilians and 200 rescue team members. He stood there holding that lever, watching thousands of people stream through the opening he was keeping open for them. Jiho's voice began to break again. The last thing he said to me was, "Tell Admiral Park that the mission was a success. Everyone got out." And Sergeant Bay? Professor Vector asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. When the evacuation was complete, the door slammed shut. Sergeant Bay was still on the other side when the hegemony guards reached that section. Jiho wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. We found his body later, after the battle was over. He was still gripping that manual override lever. The auditorium was completely silent except for the soft humming of the translation devices. The weight of one man's sacrifice to save thousands of others was almost too much to bear. You analyze our victory as if it were a chess match, Jiho said, his voice stronger now despite his tears. But every piece that moved on your holographic display was someone's child, parent, or sibling. We didn't win because we were smarter or stronger. We won because we couldn't bear to lose the people we loved. The massive auditorium remained completely silent for what felt like an eternity. Hundreds of cadets from dozens of different species sat motionless, processing what they had just heard. The only sounds were the soft humming of translation devices and the quiet ventilation system cycling air through the enormous space. Professor Vector stood frozen on the stage, his 6 arms hanging at his sides. For the first time in his 30-year teaching career, he found himself without words. His compound eyes stared at the holographic display, showing the aftermath of the Battle of Kepler 442b. But now he saw it completely differently than he had an hour ago. Finally he spoke, his voice much quieter than usual. Cadet Kim, your account suggests that human military doctrine operates on fundamentally different principles from established galactic norms. You prioritize individual initiative over centralized command structure, emotional bonds over logical, efficiency and personal sacrifice over asset preservation. Jiho wiped his eyes one final time and straightened his shoulders. The tears were gone now, replaced by something stronger. That's exactly right, Professor. And that's why your analysis missed the real lesson of Kepler 442b. He looked around the auditorium, meeting the eyes of cadets from species across the galaxy. Some looked confused, others appeared thoughtful, and a few seemed to be seeing humans in an entirely new light. Every military academy in the known galaxy teaches the same basic principles, Jiho continued. Maintain formation integrity, preserve valuable assets, calculate acceptable losses, follow the chain of command. These aren't bad rules. They work well for most situations. Professor Vector nodded slowly. These principles have guided successful military operations for thousands of years across hundreds of different civilizations. But humans learned warfare differently, Jiho said. We come from a planet where we were never the strongest species, never the fastest, never the most numerous. For most of our history, we were prey animals trying to survive against creatures that could kill us easily. He gestured toward the holographic display, which still showed the chaotic final moments of the battle. We survived on Earth by adapting, improvising, and never giving up on members of our group. A human alone dies quickly. Humans working together can overcome almost anything. A tall Rigelian cadet in the front section raised one of her forearms. But surely these primitive survival instincts would be disadvantageous in modern space. Warfare? Advanced technology requires logical, systematic thinking. You're half right, Jiho replied. Logic and systems are important, but they're not everything. When Admiral Park faced that ultimatum about the hostages, pure logic said to sacrifice 15,000 civilians to preserve 18 military ships. But human logic includes something your computers can't calculate. Which is? Professor Vector asked. The value of hope, Jiho said simply. Every human who fought at Kepler 442b believed that no situation was completely hopeless, as long as people were willing to try impossible things for each other. The auditorium stirred with quiet conversations, as alien cadets discussed this concept among themselves. Hope as a military asset was not something covered in their tactical training. Suddenly, another human cadet stood up 3 rows ahead of Jiho. It was Dongyun Park, a third-year student from the Mars colonies. Professor, I'd like to support what Cadet Kim is saying. My family operates a mining station in the outer system. Last year, when our life support systems failed, we sent a distress signal. Professor Vector's attention shifted to the new speaker. What does this have to do with military tactics, Cadet Park? 3 different species received our emergency call, Dongyun continued. The Centaurians calculated that a rescue mission would cost more than our lives were worth. The Draconians determined that our remote location made assistance logistically impractical. The Altarians concluded that our situation was probably hopeless anyway. Several alien cadets shifted uncomfortably as they recognized their species. Typical responses to emergency situations. But a human cargo ship captain named Haeun Choi heard the same distress call, Dongyun said. Her ship was 3 days away at maximum burn. She was carrying time-sensitive medical supplies to another colony, and she had no guarantee that we would still be alive when she arrived. What did she do? Asked a Centaurian cadet. She dumped her cargo, overloaded her engines, and reached us in 18 hours, Dongyun replied. She saved 43 people, including my entire family. When we asked her why she risked her ship and her career for strangers, she said it was simple. We were human, and humans don't abandon each other. More human cadets began standing throughout the auditorium. There were only 12 humans enrolled at the academy, but now every one of them was on their feet. Jiho felt a surge of pride as he realized he wasn't alone in this moment. But then something unexpected happened. A Rigelian cadet stood up in the middle section, then another. A Centaurian near the back rose from her seat, followed by 2 Altarians and a massive Ursine student. What are you doing? Professor Vector asked, confusion clear in his translated voice. The Rigelian cadet who had first stood answered. Professor, my homeworld of Rigel Prime was attacked by pirates 2 years ago. Our defense fleet was overwhelmed, and our government was preparing to surrender to minimize civilian casualties. She gestured toward the human cadets. A human patrol group happened to be passing through our system, just 4 ships against a pirate fleet of over 30 vessels. By every logical calculation, they should have continued to their original destination and reported the attack to their superiors. Professor Vector was beginning to understand where this was going. But they didn't. Captain Sarah Kim, no relation, to Cadet Kim here, called for immediate reinforcements and then attacked the pirate fleet with just her 4 ships. The Rigelian continued. She held them off for 6 hours until human reinforcements arrived. My family's city would have been destroyed if she had followed logical protocols instead of human instincts. More alien cadets continued standing. A Vegan whose colony ship had been rescued by human traders. an Altarian whose research station had been saved during a solar storm, a Draconian whose merchant vessel had been defended by human escorts against raiders. Professor Vector slowly turned in a complete circle, looking at the dozens of standing students. I see. You have all experienced human military assistance. Personally. Not just military assistance, corrected the Centaurian cadet. Human philosophy, the idea that some things are worth fighting for even when victory seems impossible. Jiho felt overwhelmed by the support he was seeing. These alien students understood what he had been trying to explain better than he had dared to hope. Professor, Jiho said, drawing attention back to himself. You asked me to explain how 18 ships defeated 300. The real answer isn't in tactics or technology or luck. It's in understanding what humans are willing to do when we're fighting, for something we can't bear to lose. Professor Vector looked at his holographic display one more time, then slowly began manipulating the controls. The images of ship movements and tactical formations disappeared, replaced by a simple text display. Class dismissed, he announced. I have a curriculum to rewrite. The auditorium began to empty, but many cadets approached Jiho as they left. Some wanted to shake his hand, others asked questions about human culture and military philosophy. A few simply nodded with new respect as they passed. But the most significant moment came when Professor Vector walked up to Jiho directly. Cadet Kim, would you consider guest lecturing for my advanced tactics course next semester? I believe my students and I have much to learn about the human approach to impossible situations. Jiho smiled, thinking of Admiral Park, Commander Cho, Lieutenant Kang, Sergeant Bay, and all the others who had made the impossible possible at Kepler 442b. I'd be honored, Professor. But remember, we didn't win that battle because we were special. We won because when everything seemed hopeless, we chose to hope anyway. As the last cadets filed out of the auditorium, Professor Vector remained, on the stage, staring at his now empty holographic display. For 30 years, he had taught military tactics as a science of mathematics and logic. Now he realized he had been missing the most important variable in the equation, the human variable, the refusal to accept defeat when fighting for something greater than yourself. He began making notes for his revised curriculum, starting with a simple question that no military academy had ever thought to ask. What are you willing to fight for, and why? Outside the auditorium, Jiho walked across the academy grounds with a lighter heart than he had felt in years. His sister Yuna was alive and safe on New Sol, rebuilding her life after her ordeal. Sergeant Bay and the others were gone, but their sacrifice had meaning beyond tactical analysis. They had taught the galaxy that humans don't just fight battles, they fight for each other, and sometimes that makes all the difference between victory and defeat.